Hello everyone. The Cold War was less of a war and more of a system that structured politics and international relations in Europe between 1945 and 1991. In this Cold War, ordinary citizens were meant to be either pro-capitalist or pro-communist for the USA or for the Soviet Union. However, in today's lecture, we will be examining the ways that this dichotomy was challenged by numerous groups throughout the period. In 1950, following the invasion of South Korea by the North, US officials feared that a massive Soviet invasion of Western Europe was imminent. To protect the Europeans from this threat, the US initiated a massive military build-up on the continent and sought to rearm West Germany, which had had its armed forces dismantled following Hitler's defeat. As the Second World War had only ended 5 years ago, Germany's neighbours had no interest in seeing Germany rearm, and Europeans took to the streets in their thousands to protest. Protests also occurred in West Germany itself, where the Chancellor, conservative Christian Konrad Adenauer, warned of communist subversion and painted his opponents as Reds, even when such accusations were extremely unfair. Following the collapse of a plan for a joint European army, the EDC, West Germany rearmed and joined NATO in the middle years of the 1950s. The French colonial wars in Vietnam and Algeria that we discussed a couple of lectures back stimulated the rise of mass committed protests in France itself. Resistance to the wars came from both the French intelligentsia and ordinary workers alike. The Communist Party took the lead in resisting the wars, refusing, for example, to grant funding for the extremely expensive conflicts. Numerous military scandals also broke out as generals would publish scathing pieces criticizing fellow generals and the government. Debacles in both wars brought the downfall of numerous governments in Paris, as neither the left nor the right seemed capable of winning victory. In the end, as we have seen, tensions in Algeria among white French settlers brought down the entire political system in France, ending the brief period of the Fourth Republic and ushering in the Fifth Republic under President de Gaulle. The UK was the third nation in the world to detonate a nuclear bomb successfully after the US and the Soviet Union. Many Britons deeply opposed nuclear weapons, however. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or CND, was founded in 1957 to protest British ownership of nuclear weapons. The CND was especially popular with intellectuals and members of the left-wing Labour Party. In 1960, pressures from Labour CND members even managed to get the Labour Party to adopt unilateral disarmament, which meant banning British nuclear weapons even if other countries refused to get rid of theirs, as part of the official Labour Party platform. The most high-profile events conducted by the CND were annual marches at Easter to Aldermaston, a small town in southern England, from Trafalgar Square in central London. Aldermaston was chosen as the endpoint of these marches due to the large nuclear weapons research facility located there. West Germans were particularly worried about atomic weapons. In the event of a future war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, it would be Germany that would be at the front line. NATO conducted secret exercises where, stimulating a future Warsaw Pact invasion, they dropped numerous bombs on German territory to block the hypothetical Soviet advance. Such an action would wipe Germany and Germans off the map forever. Moreover, the West German government was actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons for itself in the hope of achieving equality with France and Britain. The Socialist Party in Germany, the SPD, as well as the trade unions, organized a war against atomic death to protest the nuclear weapons policy of their government. Most West Germans supported the cause of getting rid of nuclear weapons, but continued to vote for their government regardless. After the SPD pulled out of the protest campaign, dissenting Germans established Easter marches of their own, which attracted 100,000 participants by 1964. Many of the Easter marchers in both Britain and West Germany, as well as war resistors in France, were accused of being communist sympathizers, known as fellow travelers, even when these groups went out of their way to distance themselves from the Soviet Union. Indeed, the Soviet crushing of the Hungarian Revolution and the Prague Spring caused many people who were actually communists to rethink their beliefs and their sympathies. Supporting capitalism was still unthinkable, especially after the US began its war in Vietnam. As a result, socialist thinkers developed the concept of the New Left, which would attempt to advocate for a socialism with a human face and attack both sides of the Cold War for being overly bureaucratic and repressive. The New Left saw a shift away from the left's traditional working-class blue-collar support to an embrace of the middle classes, especially students and state sector workers. The 1960s saw the increasing influence of the political counterculture in Europe. The movement Provo, not to be confused with the Provisional IRA, was founded in the Netherlands in 1965. Provo attempted to use games and antics to goad the police into using violence, thus showing the inherently violent nature of the political system. Provo wants to revive anarchy and teach it to the young, said the movement's leadership in one of their magazines. Provo received much attention and support from beatnik and New Left types throughout Europe, but closed themselves down in 1967 after their antics managed to force the chief of police and the mayor in Amsterdam to resign. The Situationist International was a French group of artists formed in the late 1950s that attempted to eliminate capitalism through a revolution of everyday life. The Situationists attempted to pull off the facade of ordinary people's lives and show the inherent propaganda which lay beneath, thus inciting a revolution. The most famous Situationist was Guy Debord, whose Society of the Spectacle argued that obsession, even fetishification of consumer goods, had thoroughly infiltrated people's lives. In 1965, US President Lyndon Johnson used a confusing incident between US and North Vietnamese ships in the Bay of Tonkin as a pretext to send hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans to prop up the weak government in South Vietnam. The US also initiated a massive bombing campaign on targets in both North and South Vietnam. The amount of ordnance dropped from US planes in Vietnam exceeded that dropped in the entirety of the Second World War. The Vietnam War encouraged massive levels of protest in Europe, even though no European nation sent its forces into the country. Europeans saw the war in Vietnam as the big US picking on a small innocent nation, and many became convinced that the Vietnam War was a result of the same Cold War system that dominated their own continent. In London, West Berlin, and Rome, hundreds of thousands took to the streets in protest of the war. Numerous factions rubbed shoulders together. Christians and liberals wanted peace, the New Left wanted a reappraisal of NATO's Cold War strategy, and Maoists, Europeans in awe of China's Cultural Revolution, wanted to use the example of Vietnam to bring a revolution to their own countries. The figure of the guerrilla fighter, whether Vietnamese or Cuban, was venerated, and portraits of Chairman Mao, Ho Chi Minh, or Che Guevara were found in dorm rooms across Europe. Whereas President Kennedy had been revered and admired, President Johnson and especially President Nixon became figures of hatred and derision. I should note, however, that the anti-Vietnam War protesters remained a minority in every European country, where the majority of public opinion continued to support the US and view the protesters as hippies or as communists. Some European protesters sought to bring the Vietnam War home to their countries. This would involve committing violent acts against the authorities in order to encourage a wide uprising and the overthrow of NATO. Because of their lack of support, revolutionaries espousing these theories had to limit their actions to hit-and-run attacks and terrorism. The most famous of these terrorist groups was the West German Red Army faction, or RAF. The RAF originally held a lot of support amongst the West German intelligentsia, despite being condemned by the SPD, who are now in power in West Germany's first ever socialist government. They carried out a number of bank robberies, bombings, kidnappings, and shootings in the 1970s and 80s, including attacking US military bases. Slowly, the group lost support as their attacks turned away from being about overthrowing the government and became more ways of gaining money and rescuing comrades. Eventually, the collapse of the Soviet Union and China's turn away from traditional communism led to many RAF members doubting their cause, and the organization ceased its terrorist attacks in 1993. The Green Movement grew in prominence in the 1970s in response to increased concerns about the dangers of nuclear power. Major nuclear power accidents such as 3 Mile Island in the US in 1979 and especially the Chernobyl disaster in the Soviet Union a decade later gave the Green Movement much popular support, as green groups were the only ones openly opposing the use of nuclear energy. Environmentalists from West Germany, Switzerland, and France protested together at nuclear power stations built on the border of the three countries. The Green Movement was not dominated by the single issue of nuclear power, but also protested other ecological calamities, such as the widespread strip mining practiced in West Germany. Differences emerged in the Green Movement over the extent to which capitalism was responsible for the environmental damage seen across the planet. The first Green political party to achieve major success was the German party Die Grünen, who arrived in parliament in 1983 and remained a prominent force in German politics today. Squatting is the process of moving into an unoccupied, often derelict building and using this building as a space to live and work in. The squatting movement emerged from fears that the redevelopment in European cities would push out the poor who made these cities their home. In effect, these were early gentrification protests. Squatters were not only looking for homes, but also organized the spaces that they occupied to serve the community and practice forms of socialism. Socialist and countercultural groups protected buildings and squatters from the police, and developers either through direct action or in the courts of law. Squatting was a powerful movement in the Netherlands, West Germany, and in Italy, where there was even a fascist squatters movement. Squatting also helped to keep some inner-city neighborhoods their working-class identities, delaying gentrification for decades. Opponents of squatting accused the squatters of making their cities unhygienic and dangerous, and pointed out that many of the derelict buildings were death traps and disasters waiting to happen. The last major protest in the Cold War years once more revolved around the issue of nuclear weapons. In 1979, NATO sought to upgrade its nuclear missiles in Europe, citing the actions of the Soviet Union, which had upgraded its own missiles a couple of years earlier, as its justification. This decision rekindled earlier European fears of a nuclear war, especially as the Reagan administration, which came to office in 1981, began making noises about winning a nuclear conflict and implying that death was preferable to communism. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans took to the streets to protest nuclear weapons, especially in the UK, the Netherlands, and West Germany. The CND experienced a major revival in interest, reaching almost 100,000 members in the early 1980s, and the Labour Party once more adopted the policy of unilateral nuclear disarmament that they had given up in 1961. Protesters did not only march in the big European cities, but also took their protests to rural areas, chaining themselves to US bases and missile silos to raise attention for their cause. In October 1983, just as the new missiles were about to be installed, 3 million people marched across Europe in the largest political demonstrations seen in the continent in all time. Their protests were ignored, and the new nuclear warheads sat in Europe for 4 years before talks between Reagan and Gorbachev resulted in a slow and controlled disarmament. The fact that NATO stayed intact during the Cold War, and even expanded following its conclusion, should not lead us to forget the effort of hundreds of thousands of protesters who marched against the Cold War system. The causes espoused by the groups above often ended in failure, but they educated and revitalized their publics. Many of the causes, such as squatting and the ecological movement, remain important issues in 21st century Europe, and the green political movement retains a strong, if unspectacular, following. On the other hand, NATO not only still exists, but it expanded after the end of the Cold War. NATO countries still possess nuclear weapons and large, if currently underfunded, armies.